Hi guys, it's Allie, here's Ginny, and today we are going to be talking about retellings. So what is a retelling? A retelling is taking any pre-established story with its own tropes and topics and themes, anything that is relatively well-known, like a classic, a well-known true story, or most popularly something like a fairy tale, taking those stories and all of those aspects that make that story unique, and then altering it in a way that presents it into a new medium, a new time period, a new genre, something like that, that is still the same core story, but has new elements added in that make it a familiar yet different experience. Retellings are a type of story that is somewhat divisive, I guess you could say. I know plenty of people who absolutely adore them, and plenty of people who absolutely despise them. And both of those feelings are totally valid, but when you talk to people who really dislike retellings, it seems that the major complaint they have about them is that they are just ripping off a pre-established story. That can, for certain books, be a really valid argument. There are plenty of retellings out there that really just kind of rip off the original story, add very minor changes, and then pass it off as some unique work. And a lot of times they get away with that because most of those classics and most of those fairy tales are free for the picking. There's nobody who's going to copyright claim you on the story of Cinderella. But that is certainly not a blanket statement for all retellings. There are plenty of retellings that seek to, rather than just rip off a storyline, take certain key elements and Easter eggs and plot points or themes, take those bare minimum elements of a story and repurpose it into something new and shiny. And I think that can turn out really cool, especially if you are a big fan of whatever original story is being retold. The way I see it, there are three major topics or types of retellings based on how much they take from the original story. And for each of those different categories, there is a different way to make that kind of retelling successful. The first category of retelling is something that teeters on just heavily inspired, but is still taking an active stance to be a retelling of a certain story. These stories strip their original works down to their barest forms and pick and choose very conservatively as to which elements they're going to pull into their own story. There are so many Cinderella type stories out there that do follow some semblance of the Cinderella story without being actively a clear Cinderella retelling. And I'm not saying that just the rich guy, poor girl trope is in and of itself a Cinderella story, because it's not. But if you have that rich guy, poor girl trope plus any kind of ball or slipper or magic godmother or anything like that, if you take any more of those aspects of the Cinderella story, then it starts to remind readers of the Cinderella story without actively being a true retelling that follows all of the different plot beats that that original story had. The category that barely takes anything from its original work is the most loose type of retelling, where the story can really go in any direction. It's not beholden to the plot points of the original in any way, shape, or form. It's just pulling on some familiar aspects to draw you further into the story by giving you something familiar to latch onto. The second category increases the amount of things that you take from the original work. So if the first category just took major elements or just vague notions of certain plot points or certain themes, this second category is going to generally adhere to the major plot of the story. It's also going to have some similarities in terms of theme, in terms of pacing and whatnot, but it's usually going to alter something very influential about the story, like the medium or the genre, something like that, or even just the overall premise. So if you take the story of Cinderella and then make Cinderella into a cyborg and put her into a futuristic society rather than this kind of European fairy tale, and then putting her into a futuristic society as a cyborg, then you get Cinder by Marissa Meyer, and that change is not only going to change the character of Cinderella herself, but it's going to change all of the events that happen to her after that point, because you have changed the genre, the setting, and some major plot points of that story. These stories all take the general idea of a story and turn it on its head to the point where it's clear that they are trying to retell this story, but it is always a question as to whether or not the story is going to end the same way in this world as it ended in the original fairy tale or true story or movie or whatever the case may be as to what original work they're pulling from. That takes the just vague familiarity of the first category of retelling and adds an additional layer of comfort to it where we think that we understand how the story is going to end. But because of these changes that are happening in the story that the author has put in, we are kind of tense where we're not really sure if the story is going to end the same way we expect. And that's actually a really clever way of making your audience unaware or not sure as to where the characters are going to end up, because we don't necessarily trust that our expectations are going to come true in this new premise or this new setting, whatever the case may be. Finally, the third type of retelling takes the original and really just changes something major yet ultimately superficial about the story as we know it. So this would be your A Cinderella story movie franchise. The Cinderella story movies take the original Cinderella fairy tale and just take it into a modern setting. So of course, like with the previous category, that is going to change certain aspects of the story as we know it, because if you don't have magic or a fairy godmother or horse-drawn carriages in your retelling, but you have it in your original, then you're going to need to find some alternate way to make that make sense. However, just because you have those changes doesn't necessarily mean that it is going to impact what that means for the rest of the story. Just because you put Cinderella into a modern setting doesn't mean she's not going to get the prince. There's a stark difference between something like Cinder by Marissa Meyer, where the Cinderella story is changed not only in its time period and its setting, but also in its premise, and also in the character, and also in the kind of topics and themes that it's delving into. The story remains a retelling, but it is changed much more fundamentally in the second category than it is in the third, which is really just Cinderella but modern now. All three of these types of retellings can be really successful, in my opinion. I think you have the biggest room for failure in the third category, because if you try to do a third category retelling but don't make it clear that that's what you're trying to do, as a Cinderella story includes Cinderella in the title, if you don't make it absolutely clear that that is what you're doing, then it runs the risk of seeming like a ripoff, and you have to make the change worthwhile. You don't want to take a story like Beauty and the Beast and then make the Beast still a beast, but just a slightly different type of beast. Maybe rather than being more of like a buffalo, he's more of a dragon. That doesn't ultimately change anything about the story. The story could still go exactly as it was originally created, and your change of having him look different or sound different is not actually going to change anything about the story, so it just feels like a ripoff to write it that way. By contrast, you can take that same story and put it in a new genre, in a new setting, and that is going to make it more interesting to read throughout the rest of the story. If we know exactly where it's going, it's not going to be fun to see how it plays out. That's why this third category is best done when it is shameless fun, of just let's see what happens if we make Cinderella a modern girl working at a diner. What happens if we do Beauty and the Beast, but they're all robots now? What happens if you do this, etc., etc., etc.? That is what's fun to read, because it is a familiar story put into a unique circumstance. That is essentially what the third category is just let's see what happens if we take this story and put it into this new surrounding. The second category of retelling for me is done most successfully when it is a lot of changes piled on top of each other. So it's a similar situation where you are being clear of what you're trying to replicate, but there's so many changes compared to the minor changes in the third category that you're no longer sure if the story is going to be able to end in the way you expect. So that's what I think is so successful about those, because if you pile up too many changes, then you fall down into that kind of first category, and if you don't include enough, then you fall into the third. So that second category, which is probably the most saturated of the categories in terms of YA books, at least that I've read, that's where I feel like those really shine, is where it's just enough difference to the point where you're not actually sure if the story is going to end the way you expect, but it is just familiar enough that it is definitely clear what the author is trying to replicate with that story. The first category, because it's kind of the most lax of the retellings, you really have a lot of different options as to where to go with that. So as long as you include certain elements, if you're doing a Cinderella retelling and you just include vaguely a evil stepmother situation and there's just a ball that happens in the story at some point or some variation of a party, then that might be all that you include. That might just be as far as you go. But you're still actively trying to make the story reminiscent of Cinderella without following all of the different plot points. And these are the easiest stories to forget that they are a retelling of something else. But again, that's not really the point of this first category. This first category seeks to present you with something original by grasping your attention with little sprinkles of the familiar. Anything less than that, and it might just seem like you are heavily inspired by a classic story or by a true story or by a fairy tale, whatever the case may be, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. People in the first category are usually just trying to keep just enough elements of the original to keep people interested in the story as it progresses in a unique and original path. There are plenty of bad retellings out there, and to be honest, I've read a lot of them because at the end of the day, I feel like sometimes with a retelling, all we want is to revisit a story that we already love with a fresh pair of eyes or with a fresh voice. And a lot of times that's what a bad retelling can be. It can be just, hey, let me reread the story of Beauty and the Beast, but the Beast looks a little different. And sometimes that's all you want, and that's all you're gonna get with some of these bad retellings. But there are plenty of stories out there, especially that second category, which is probably my favorite, and those are stories where you really feel like you are visiting characters who you already know, but they're different now, and their situation is so different, and the story is so different, and is it even going to end the way you expect it to end? And that can be really fun to read as well. And those are some of my favorite retellings to read. I absolutely adore those type of books. Whether or not retellings are your cup of tea, there are definitely ways to do it well and to do it in a way that isn't just ripping off the original. I hope that by splitting retellings into these kind of three categories that I usually consider them falling under will help to mitigate some of these thoughts that retellings are either just being vaguely inspired by something or completely ripping something off, because I feel like while those are certain aspects of the different categories, there's also that second category there wedged in the middle where I feel like some of the most successful retellings lie, and some of the most fun retellings are in that third category where it's really just shameless fun of, hey, let's look at this story again with new eyes. And that is going to be all for me this week. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, do give it a like, and if you like my content, do subscribe. I make videos every Friday, and leave down in the comments below what is your favorite retelling you have ever experienced. It could be something you read, something you watched, something you saw on YouTube. Any of the different mediums are totally cool. I love retellings, as I've probably shown through this video, but I would love to get my paws on any of them that I possibly can, so leave those suggestions for me down below, and also be sure to leave me some questions because my 1-year booktube anniversary is coming up and I am planning on filming a Q&A, so I need some questions for you guys to ask me, and that can be down in the comments below. It could be on Twitter, it could be on Curious Cat. All of those links are going to be in my description as always, and that is going to be it for this week. So thank you so much for watching again, and I will see you in the next one.